It began with a box of tapes found inside a police storage unit in rural Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. A quiet, unremarkable town where most people still left their doors unlocked, and the loudest sound at night was the hum of power lines cutting through the forest. The tapes had no official record, no evidence tag, no case number, just a fading label scrawled in black marker that read, "Marsh Property, Do Not Review." In 2017, a 27-year-old journalist named Alex Morton was digitizing old police archives for his podcast, Cold Files, America's Forgotten Cases. He wasn't searching for ghosts or unsolved mysteries. He was searching for forgotten paperwork, for stories lost in bureaucratic dust. That's when he played the first tape. The audio began with static, the kind that isn't just noise, but something alive, something that breathes in rhythm with your pulse. Then a man's voice emerged, cracked and exhausted, saying, "If anyone hears this, don't go to the Marsh house. The walls, remember, the walls." And then silence. The recording cut off suddenly, and in that brief dead air came something that froze Alex in his chair, a faint, strangled scream. He replayed it, rewound the tape, leaned closer to his headphones, but the scream was gone. It hadn't recorded properly, or maybe it had never been there at all. He checked the date on the case file, April 3, 1994. That same day, the Marsh family's farmhouse had burned to the ground, killing 5 family members. Or rather, 4. The mother, Eleanor Marsh, was never found. The Marsh case had been closed decades ago, marked as accidental. No one had revisited it. But now Alex had something that wasn't supposed to exist. He didn't know it yet, but that single tape would pull him into the most inexplicable disappearance in Pennsylvania's history, and into something far older than fire. Locals had always avoided Hollow Creek Road, where the Marsh house once stood. Even before the fire, neighbors spoke in whispers about strange things. Lights flickering when the power was out, shadows moving behind the upstairs curtains, and a smell that drifted through the trees like wet paint and iron. Eleanor Marsh had been an artist, well known once for portraits so lifelike they unsettled the viewers. Her husband Richard was a carpenter, quiet and kind. They had 3 children, Lucy, Aaron, and baby Thomas. The family had moved to that house in 1982, but after Richard's workshop accident in 1990, something inside Eleanor had changed. She withdrew from everyone, stopped showing her work, stopped answering letters. By 1993, her mail lay unopened in a pile by the roadside. Some said she was working on her masterpiece. Others whispered she was painting something she shouldn't have. When Alex played more of the tape, the static deepened until it became almost a heartbeat. Then another voice came through, a woman whispering, her tone fragmented and terrified. "They said it remembers. The walls, the floor, don't touch the red paint. Don't touch it." The words repeated faster and faster, disintegrating into gasps and static. The last thing captured before the audio dissolved was the sound of breathing, slow, human, close to the microphone. He checked the metadata again. The recording had been logged by the Clearfield Police Department during their initial investigation into the Marsh fire. Yet there was no mention of any tape in the official records. When Alex called the county sheriff's office to confirm, the clerk told him flatly that no such evidence existed. When he pressed further, the line went dead. Hours later, an email arrived in his inbox from an untraceable address. It contained only 5 words. "Stop listening to the walls." The message didn't stop him. Days later, Alex drove 6 hours from Pittsburgh to Clearfield and followed an old dirt road until the GPS went blank. There, in the middle of the forest, stood what was left of the Marsh property. The air was unnaturally still. The sign on the fence read "Unsafe Structure." Entry prohibited, though there was little left of a structure to forbid. The stone foundation was half swallowed by moss. What remained of the basement door was fused shut by years of rust and weather. Alex stepped closer. The forest seemed to hush as he did. He heard a faint sound, steady, rhythmic dripping, as though water was falling from somewhere underground, but the soil beneath him was dry. When he brushed his hand against the charred wall, his fingers came away streaked in something dark and red. It wasn't brick dust. It wasn't rust. It was wet paint, fresh, gleaming under the weak light of day. That night, at a cheap motel on the edge of town, Alex plugged his recorder into his laptop to review the sounds he'd captured. The dripping was gone. In its place was a faint whisper, barely audible, yet clear enough to stop his breath. A woman's voice, speaking softly into the microphone. "Welcome back, Eleanor." He stared at the screen for a long time. He hadn't said anything into that recorder. No one had. The next morning he went to the Clearfield Historical Society, where an elderly volunteer named Janet Myers remembered the Marsh family vividly. They said Eleanor went mad after her husband died, she told him. The fire came a few months later, but the strange thing wasn't the fire. It was what the firefighters saw inside. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Every wall, every ceiling, she'd painted eyes, hundreds of them, all looking right at you. She showed him an old newspaper clipping from 1994. The photo captured the ruins of the house, blackened beams reaching toward a gray sky. But just above the charred mantel, one painting had survived. A portrait of a woman with no face, her head tilted slightly, as though she'd turned to watch the photographer. The caption beneath read, "The last known work of local artist Eleanor Marsh." That night, Alex uploaded part of the recovered audio to his podcast. Within 24 hours, the clip went viral. Thousands of listeners claimed to hear different things. Some heard children laughing. Others swore they heard footsteps pacing behind them. But the most disturbing messages came from those who listened after midnight. They said the voice on the tape whispered their name. A few claimed their walls began to knock from the inside. By the third day, the recording was removed from every platform, flagged for potentially harmful content. But it was already too late. Those who had listened couldn't unhear it. A week later, Alex vanished. The last message he ever sent was to his producer. A single panicked email sent at 3:14 a.m., the same minute his live recorder feed went dark. The message read, "She's not dead. She's inside the walls. Tell them not to paint. The color wakes her up." No one ever heard from him again. The official story of the Marsh fire was simple enough. A short circuit in the basement studio sparked a blaze that consumed the farmhouse in under 20 minutes. But what was written in the police reports and what people actually saw that night were two very different things. The case file, what little of it remained, spoke in tidy phrases and bureaucratic tone. Origin point indeterminate. Bodies located, cause of death consistent with smoke inhalation. But locals who had stood on the road that night watching the sky turn red said the fire burned wrong. The smoke didn't rise. It curled downward, hugging the ground like fog, thick and dark as oil. Neighbors first saw the glow around midnight. One of them, a truck driver named Carl Weber, told reporters he'd heard screaming before the fire trucks arrived, but not the kind of screaming you hear from a burning house. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting. By the time the first responders reached Hollow Creek Road, the roof had already collapsed. Flames clawed through the windows, pulsing like breath. When the fire chief, David Long, sent his crew inside to search for survivors, they lasted less than 2 minutes before one of them stumbled out, vomiting into the grass. "Eyes," he kept saying, over and over. "There are eyes on the walls." At dawn, when the smoke cleared, the firefighters found 4 bodies. Richard Marsh and the 3 children. Their positions suggested they had been trying to get to the basement. There was no trace of Eleanor. The investigators assumed she'd been trapped beneath the collapsed floor. They never found her remains. What they did find was stranger. A section of wall still standing amid the ruins, its surface covered in melted paint. Beneath the soot, faint outlines of faces were visible, stretched and distorted as if they had been trying to push through the plaster. The police took photographs, but the negatives later went missing from the evidence locker. The coroner, Dr. Evelyn Pike, resigned a month later, refusing to speak publicly about what she'd seen during the autopsies. The only record she left was a single line in her notes. None of the bodies show evidence of smoke in the lungs. They were dead before the fire. For years afterward, people tried to forget about the Marsh family. The house was bulldozed, but the land never sold. Even the real estate agency refused to list it. Locals said the soil wouldn't take new construction. Every time someone tried to pour a foundation, the concrete would crack before it set. Trees refused to grow near the old well, and animals went missing in the woods. But the strangest thing was the sound. Hunters said that if you stood near the property after dark, you could hear faint scratching, like brushes dragging across canvas, even when the wind was still. In 1995, a group of paranormal researchers from Philadelphia heard about the case and came to investigate. They were called the Cold Light Society, a small team of self-proclaimed investigators who specialized in residual hauntings. Their names were Brian Keller, his sister Amy, and a cameraman, Will Torres. The three of them arrived one afternoon in late September, set up recording equipment around the property, and camped there overnight. They never came back. Their van was found abandoned 3 miles down the road, the back doors open, cameras missing. The only piece of evidence recovered was a torn section of audio tape caught in a fence near the foundation. When police spooled it back, they heard a woman's voice saying, "He's watching from the frame." Then the sound of shattering glass, followed by a whisper that matched Eleanor Marsh's old phone messages almost perfectly. "Tell them not to look." The case was reopened briefly but closed again for lack of evidence. Locals said the police didn't want to admit what they'd heard on that tape. Some of the officers resigned afterward. One of them, Officer Dale Warren, moved out of state and later sent an anonymous letter to a local newspaper. It was never printed, but the editor kept a copy. In it, Warren wrote, "There was something alive in that basement. We didn't burn it, we set it free." When Alex Morton began digging into the story 20 years later, he found fragments of those same police notes buried in the county archives. Some pages had been cut cleanly from the files. Others were covered in black marker lines that bled through the paper. But the deeper he went, the more he began to notice the same phrase repeating in the margins of different reports, written in different handwriting, over different years. "She's still painting." That phrase haunted him. He couldn't shake the idea that maybe Eleanor hadn't died in the fire, that maybe she'd done something else entirely, something no one understood. He spent nights listening to the digitized tapes through headphones, searching for anything human behind the static. Sometimes he thought he heard a faint voice whispering words that didn't make sense. Other times, it was the sound of a brushstroke, long and deliberate, like someone painting just behind him. In late November, he tracked down the last living member of the original fire crew, retired Lieutenant Harold Dean. The old man lived alone in a nursing home outside Du Bois. When Alex asked about that night, Harold refused to meet his eyes. "We shouldn't have gone in there," he said. "She didn't want to be saved. She wanted witnesses." When Alex pressed for details, the old man's breathing grew heavy. "The paint," he whispered, "she mixed it with blood." Hat night, Alex wrote in his notes that every answer only led to another question, and every source either refused to talk or vanished after speaking to him. The walls of his motel room began to smell faintly of turpentine. He thought it was his imagination, until he saw the red smear appear across the bathroom mirror, thin and wet, like someone had dragged a finger dipped in paint. He wiped it away, but the mark returned each morning, always in the same place. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at his apartment in Pittsburgh. No return address. Inside was a roll of film and a single sheet of paper with the words, "You wanted proof." When he developed the film, there were 5 photographs. The first 4 were of the Marsh property, the foundation, the old well, the remains of the staircase. The 5th was a picture of him, sitting at his desk, taken from outside his apartment window. In the reflection of the glass behind him stood a woman covered in ash, holding a paintbrush. The tape was already playing when Alex woke up. He didn't remember pressing play. The laptop screen flickered, frozen on the digitization software, a flat green waveform stretching across the display. The room was dark except for the glow from the monitor and the faint hiss from the speakers. Static filled the air like breath in a small room, alive, uneven, whispering between frequencies. He reached for the mouse, and a woman's voice cut through the noise, low, calm, almost intimate. "Do you see what I made for you?" Alex froze. It wasn't on any previous recording. He knew every second of that file by heart. His pulse climbed into his throat. He stopped the playback, but the voice didn't stop. The audio kept running for another 3 seconds before the feed went silent again, like something alive had just noticed him listening. He spent the next 3 days replaying every segment, trying to isolate the sound. He couldn't find it again. The waveform showed nothing, no spike, no voice, no anomaly. It was as if the moment had only existed when he heard it. Sleep became a problem after that. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, swearing he could hear whispers behind the motel walls, faint and rhythmic, like someone painting in long, patient strokes. He started keeping the lights on. One night, around 2:40 a.m., his phone buzzed, unknown number. When he answered, all he heard was faint static, and then buried under it the same whisper from the tape, "Do you see it now?" He dropped the phone. By morning, he'd packed his bags and left Clearfield, driving straight back to Pittsburgh. The longer he stayed near that property, the worse things got. His reflection twitched in mirrors half a second late. His voice recorder picked up sounds when the room was dead quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house had marked him somehow, like he'd carried something back from it. He told himself it was exhaustion, obsession, but that illusion shattered when he got home and found a padded envelope on his doorstep with no postage stamp. Inside was a cassette tape, wrapped in brown paper, written on it, in red marker, the second session. He didn't remember ever digitizing a second tape. He waited until nightfall, turned off all the lights, and pressed play. A man's voice came through first, one of the old investigators by the sound of it. The timestamp on the tape matched the same week the Cold Light Society disappeared in 1995. The voice was steady, professional, describing the layout of the Marsh basement. Concrete steps, 6 feet wide. The walls are covered in paint, red, smells like iron. Then a pause, a shuffle of feet, a breath. There's something drawn on the floor. Looks like a circle. No, a spiral. Another voice joined, nervous and whispering, "Brian, don't touch it." The recorder crackled. Then came the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, followed by a wet, dragging noise, like a brush dipped in thick paint. A woman started to cry in the background, her sobs muffled, close to the mic. "She's here," someone whispered. "She's still painting." The static roared, swallowing the rest. Alex yanked off his headphones, his heart pounding so hard it blurred the room around him. He tried to eject the tape, but the deck jammed. The reels inside kept spinning, faster and faster, until smoke rose from the machine. He yanked the cord from the wall, and for a second, just before it went dead, he swore he heard his own voice coming from the speakers, whispering something he didn't remember saying. "Don't stop her." The next morning, his laptop camera light was on. He'd unplugged it the night before. He covered it with tape, shut the lid, and went for a walk to clear his head. Every window he passed on the street seemed to reflect movement. A figure just stepping out of frame. Every passing car sounded like a whisper under the engine. When he returned home, there was a note slipped under his door. No handwriting, just printed letters cut from magazines, glued onto yellow paper. "She likes the color of your walls." That night, he painted every wall white. The smell of the paint reminded him of the Marsh basement, thick and metallic, like blood. He opened the window to let it air out, but the air didn't move. It hung heavy, humid, pressing against him. When he turned around, he saw something that froze him where he stood. In the center of the living room wall, the paint hadn't dried evenly. The brushstrokes had pooled into faint shapes, 5, maybe 6 of them. Faces, eyes, watching. He stepped closer. The smell grew stronger. Then, faintly, a voice behind him whispered, "Do you see it now?" He spun around, but the room was empty. The window was shut. The lights flickered once, twice, and the power went out. The silence that followed was alive, thick and breathing. From somewhere in the dark, his recorder clicked on by itself. Click. Static. Then a single, clear voice. "Alex, you're part of the painting now." He ran. The door wouldn't open. The knob turned but didn't move. His laptop screen lit up on its own, displaying the digitization software again, but instead of a waveform, it showed a live feed, grainy black and white. His apartment, the same angle as his webcam. In the frame, he could see himself standing by the wall, but behind him, a woman's figure was forming. Her body built out of dripping red lines, her face half-painted, half-smeared. She raised a brush toward the camera. The feed cut to black. When power returned hours later, Alex was gone. Police found his apartment empty, except for the cassette deck still smoking on the desk and the phrase "the walls." "Remember" painted across the mirror in wet red streaks. Forensics said it was paint, but the lab technician who tested it quit the next day, refusing to release the results. The apartment stood silent for 3 months after Alex Morton vanished. His landlord eventually entered with the police to clear it out. Everything looked untouched. Bed neatly made, dishes stacked, laptop closed, but the air carried a strange heaviness, like a room sealed too long without breath. The walls, recently painted white, had yellowed faintly, as though the color itself had aged. The only item missing from the apartment was Alex's notebook. A week later, a brown envelope arrived at the Pittsburgh Gazette addressed to Investigations Desk. Urgent. Inside were photocopies of handwritten notes. The last pages from Alex's missing journal. There were no dates, only a series of fragmented entries written in his sharp, hurried scrawl. The house isn't dead. It's waiting. The eyes in the paint aren't symbols. They're mirrors. She didn't vanish. She moved into her work. At the bottom of the final page, Alex had drawn a small spiral. Beneath it, one last line, "Find the room behind the wall." Those words might have meant nothing to anyone else, but to art historian Dr. Miriam Halden, they were everything. Miriam had spent years studying obscure painters whose works blurred the line between art and obsession. She'd lectured on Eleanor Marsh before, citing her as an example of psychological isolation expressed through spatial distortion. But when she read Alex's notes, something felt wrong. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was instruction. In February 2019, Miriam drove to Clearfield to visit the local museum, which still kept a few of Marsh's surviving paintings. The curator, a quiet man named Riley, led her to a locked storage room. He hesitated before opening the door. "People say her paintings shift," he muttered. "Colors that weren't there before. Maybe it's the varnish reacting over time, but—" He trailed off and pushed the door open. The smell of old canvas and linseed oil filled the air. There were 5 paintings, each covered in protective glass. They were landscapes at first glance, fields, trees, skies, but the longer Miriam looked, the more she saw something hidden beneath the layers. Shadows in the grass formed faint outlines of faces. The clouds bent in unnatural symmetry, as though following the curve of unseen eyes. In one painting, Autumn Study, the red leaves on a single oak tree seemed too vibrant, as if still wet. Miriam leaned closer and noticed that the leaves weren't leaves at all. They were brushstrokes shaped like fingerprints, tiny, dozens of them. When she adjusted the light, the painting's texture caught her eye. An uneven section in the upper right corner, slightly raised. It wasn't damaged, it was a seam. "Has anyone ever examined the back of this piece?" she asked. Riley shook his head. "No one's touched them in 20 years. With careful hands, Miriam removed the frame backing. Behind the canvas was another layer of fabric, tightly stretched and sealed. On it, faint writing appeared in faded black paint, just 2 words, "Still here." That night, Miriam stayed in a motel outside town, unable to sleep. The more she thought about the paintings, the more Alex's words echoed in her mind. "Find the room behind the wall." She opened her laptop and searched archived photographs of the Marsh house before the fire. In one of them, taken during a charity tour in 1988, she noticed something peculiar. In Eleanor's studio, there was a large rectangular patch on the far wall where no paintings hung. The light fell unevenly on it, suggesting a shallow recess behind the plaster. A hidden space. The next morning, Miriam contacted the current property caretaker and arranged a visit. The foundation was cracked and overgrown, but a portion of the basement remained intact. The caretaker unlocked the rusted door, warning her not to stay long. The structure wasn't safe. Inside, the air was cool and dry, unnaturally so. Her flashlight beam drifted across crumbling stone, burned beams, and faint traces of red along the walls. Maybe iron deposits, maybe something else. When she reached the far end, she saw it. A rectangular section of brickwork that didn't match the rest. The mortar was newer, uneven. Someone had sealed it by hand. She knocked once, hollow. There was space behind it. She took a chisel from her bag, struck the brick twice, and a small section gave way. Behind it, wrapped in plastic and untouched by fire, lay a rolled canvas tied with twine. She pulled it free carefully and unwrapped it. The painting inside was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't a portrait or landscape, but a room, a perfect recreation of the Marsh basement, down to every crack and beam. At the center stood a figure, half-finished, its body composed of red and white strokes. The face was blank. Beneath the figure, in small, delicate script, were the words, "The artist at work." As Miriam stared, her light flickered. In the split second of darkness, she thought she saw the figure in the painting move, its arm lowering slightly, as if setting down a brush. When the light steadied, the arm was back in place. She told herself it was nerves, imagination. She rewrapped the canvas and brought it back to the museum for safekeeping, locking it in a private vault. But over the next week, staff began reporting strange occurrences. One guard claimed he heard faint tapping behind the storage room wall every night, at 3 a.m. Another said he smelled turpentine in the ventilation system, though no chemicals were stored nearby. Cameras captured flickers of movement. Nothing human, just shifts in light and shadow. Then, one morning, the security footage showed something impossible. At 2:57 a.m., the sealed vault door opened on its own. The painting of the artist at work was gone. Police found no signs of forced entry, but on the empty easel where the painting had been, someone had left a single brush, bristles still wet with red paint. Miriam quit the investigation after that. She returned to teaching, refusing all interviews, but students later said she never stopped watching the classroom walls when she lectured, as if expecting them to blink. The museum quietly closed its lower gallery for renovation and never reopened it. Visitors still claim that if you walk past the old wing after dark, you can hear the faint sound of someone painting inside, slow, patient, deliberate strokes, and a soft voice humming through the static of the old security speakers, saying over and over again, "The masterpiece isn't finished yet."